Hello there and welcome to day 25, I think it is today. I'm losing track of the days now, especially on weekends. So sort of all blending in together with the Lockdown Diaries. So welcome to day 25, a bit of a rundown on tubes today. There's a lot of people that don't really understand tubes, and I guess for me it's the other way around. I really had trouble when I was doing my tech training as a technician back in the late 60s, early 70s, trying to figure out how a transistor worked, because to me, sitting in tech and looking at a diagram and them talking about holes moving was not quite the same as a vacuum tube with electrons floating. I could sort of conceive that idea in my head of electrons floating through a vacuum, but I just couldn't get my head around a hole moving through some silicon paste. And one of my esteemed colleagues years ago said something like this: if I was a musical note, I would much rather be floating through space than trudging through silicon paste. Yes. My thoughts exactly. Probably why in the 1980s, when I got introduced to tube amplifiers, which was through a client of mine, Julian in Rotorua. If you're watching, Julian, it's all thanks to you. I went to his place to take a bit of equipment, and he had a guitar amplifier that he was using in his stereo system. And that really opened my eyes to what sound could be like. I recall that he later had a Audio Research D76 valve amplifier, and that became my first amplifier because I bought that off him, or traded it I think, and it formed my first introduction to tube amplifiers. So I'm going to give you a bit of a rundown on tubes today, and I'll try and keep this pretty simple, and my apologies ahead of time for some generalizations and oversimplifications, because we can get really technical and there's a lot of detail about tubes which I don't really want to go into here, because I want to make this friendly and easy to get to grips with. So you might see the reference to tubes and a reference to valves. What's the difference? Well, they're both the same. Tubes is how the Americans refer to things, because valves are in a tube, a tubular glass envelope. But a more accurate description is what the British call them, which is valves, because if you think of a valve turning on and off your water, that's what is happening in this part of the tube, in the grid, because it is like a valve. And probably the easiest way to think of this in terms of tubes is think of the valve as limiting the flow of electrons. So what we have here is we have this part, which is shown in diagrams normally in two ways, either this way, which is an indirectly heated cathode, or a directly heated cathode, but they're basically similar in that they're shown as a K. Now I know it's not K for cathode, it's C. So why did they use a K? Well, C was already used. It was used for capacitor. So they thought K will work. So they used a K. So K is the cathode. And if you apply a voltage, small voltage, to this heater element, you'll heat up the material on the cathode. Now, if you didn't have a vacuum, if you had oxygen in there, that would burn up that material and it would be gone, done, finished. But because it's in a vacuum, that heats up the material on the cathode and releases electrons. I'll just grab a pen. So it releases these little electrons, and the electrons are floating around in this sort of electron cloud. Now, if there's no voltage up here on the anode, but there's a voltage down here, nothing's going to happen, because like magnets where, they attract or repel, if you've got no other opposing force up here or no opposing voltage, you're not going to get anything happening. So we put a voltage, a DC voltage, onto this anode, and it can be 100, 200, 300, 400 like I'm showing up there. Could be right up to 600 volts. And that, the more voltage you have there, the more you're going to get a flow of electrons through. Except for this little puppy down here, the control grid. To explain that, think of, say, some Venetian blinds. If you close the Venetian blinds, the light doesn't come through from outside. If you open them up just a little bit, then some light comes through. Open them fully horizontal and lots of light comes through. That's a bit like what this control grid is doing. And the control grid has a low voltage on there, because by a low voltage you can actually affect a greater change, because you're affecting this higher voltage with this smaller voltage on the control grid. I'm trying to keep this simple, so any of you technicians out there, give me a break on this one, because we're trying to keep this simple. So if we put a alternating signal into this cathode, then basically a negative voltage on here will repel the negative charge and let the positive charge through, and that's basically what a valve can be doing. It can be used for different things. So a valve can be used as a rectifier to convert AC into DC. It can be used as an amplifier. So we'll just talk in this instance mostly about tubes used as drivers and output tubes, in other words, as amplification devices. Because a lot of amplifiers nowadays use solid state rectifiers because they are cheaper to build, they're more efficient, less heat output, and so they can be done they do quite a good job for voltage rectification and stabilization. So we won't deal really with rectifier tubes here, although some of our amplifiers like the Prima Luna preamps do use tube rectifiers in them, but other amplifiers like, say, VTL, they don't use tube rectifiers in them. They use solid state rectifiers and multi-stage rectifiers, so they use lots of different stages for different voltages. Now, voltages. Let's get into what it's all about with voltages. And I'll just bring the camera over a bit closer. And you'll see this here. When you see a tube number, the 12 indicates the voltage. So if it's a 12AX7, 12 is the voltage that the tube is running at, as far as the heater is concerned. The AX is a manufacturer code, and the 7 is the number of elements in the tube. So if you count the anode, the cathode, the heater, the grid, the screen, etc., you can find out how many elements there are in that tube. Similarly, a 6L6, 6 volt heater, 6 elements. So that's our very basic primer on tubes for today. I'll go into a little bit more detail and show you some tubes and a tube tester and a few other things as we get more into tubes versus solid state and combinations of the two. Oh my goodness, this is going to take some time. Anyway, that's our little primer on tubes for today. Thank you very much for watching this, and we're going to get into some music now. Well, as I mentioned in a previous video, it used to be quite a different landscape in New Zealand for hi-fi. Back in the 1970s, it was just about impossible to get really good gear in New Zealand. So I mentioned about how we used to go over Norfolk Island and Fiji and places like that to buy hi-fi gear. But another thing that we used to do is we used to follow the TV and radio, I think it was called, section, or radio and TV section in the Herald, which was just pages of gear for sale. A lot of it was gear that airline pilots and stewardesses had brought back from Fiji and Norfolk Island or Australia when they were on trips. And quite a lot of it was people paying for their holidays by bringing back some gear. In fact, we used to do that quite a bit. If we knew people were travelling, we'd say, hey, if you bring back an XYZ, we'll buy it off you. And so that was how we got into selling decent quality hi-fi gear, was by bringing it in from overseas through travellers and buying it from the Herald. And we used to just go up to Auckland on a Friday night. We'd stay in a motel in Mount Eden, and we'd grab the paper at sort of 5 o'clock in the morning when it came out, and we'd circle all of the adverts that were of interest, and we'd ring the people, and we'd make up a route around, and we'd whistle around and buy gear off them. And quite often I can recall going into a person's house, and as I was walking up the path, out was coming another dealer such as Paul Money from Auckland, or somebody else that was doing the same thing, and they'd beaten me to it, or vice versa, I'd beaten them to it. So that was how we got a lot of gear in those days, because I spent years and years applying for import license to be able to import things. And back then, if you didn't have the right contacts, you didn't get the import license. And some of the big importers, big suppliers like Fisher and Paykel, who had the Panasonic agency, they would just buy up the import license that was available for the country, and then they could import their gear and stick a premium price on it, and basically nobody else got a look in. So it's quite different today when anybody can import anything from anywhere, and it's a completely different landscape. But back then it was that way. So there's another little anecdote. I'm going to post a picture, which is a picture of my system back in around 1978, I think, 79, somewhere around there. And this was taken in my lounge at home. You'll see the aforementioned steel pillar sticking up out of the floor with the Linsondeck perched on top of it. That was fitted with a Grace 707 tone arm and a Supex SD900 cartridge. Just underneath the turntable, for those of you with good eyesight, you'll spot a pair of Stax electrostatic headphones hanging there. There was a Marantz preamp and power amp, which I really regret selling now. It was certainly very collectible. And a pair of the JBL 4313 speakers that I mentioned previously. So there's a little bit of a blast from the past, both visually and as a little anecdote. And now we'll move on to some music. In the picture that I just showed of my system in 1978 or so was this album here from Thelma Houston, and it's called I've Got the Music in Me. It's a Sheffield album, and it shows you inside here the setup, because it's a direct disc recording, so they recorded it as they were cutting it to the disc. And this is quite an interesting method of doing things. The musicians have to be really on their game, and sometimes you can really tell that they're nervous and they don't really like doing it this way, but in this album there's none of that nervousness. It's very, very well done.
Ain't got no troubles in my life, no foolish dreams to make me cry. I'm never frightened or worried, I know I'll always get by. I heat up, I cool down. When something gets in my way, I go around it. Don't let life get me down. Gonna take it the way that I found it, y'all. I got
This album is Sky, the other album that was featured in the photo that I scanned earlier. And this was from 1980, so this is how I figured that the date on that photo was not correct, and it was actually a little bit later because this didn't come out till 1980. So I'm just going to play Toccata from this album. Well, that wraps up for today. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, please give me a thumbs up. If you would like to subscribe, I'd love that. And if you'd like to share this around, please do so. See you again tomorrow.